Hello, and welcome to Central Booking, where writers and readers are the authority. I'm your host, John Valeri. Today, I'm joined by Chris Wolak and Emily Fine, collectively known as the Book Cougars. Chris has spent most of her adult life working with or around books. She has been a college English professor, a bookseller, and a district manager for Borders, and has held positions in both academic and public libraries. It should also be known that she's a Willa Cather superfan. Emily, on the other hand, has spent most of her adult life wishing she worked with or around books. She has spent much of her time in the business sector with an emphasis in restaurants. So it's probably not a spoiler to say that her bookish sweet spot is where words and food intersect. Together, Chris and Emily host the Book Cougars podcast, on which they share what they've read, what they're reading, and what they hope to read next, and they invite their listeners to do the same. They recently reached a milestone, their 100th episode, and I've been lucky enough to serve as their mystery man from time to time, serving up genre commentary and recommendations. Chris and Emily have also stepped out from behind the microphone in pursuit of bookish fun, sometimes individually and sometimes together. They have moderated authors at bookstores and larger venues such as casinos throughout Connecticut, created a YouTube channel, facilitated book club discussions in person and online, and gone on local and national biblio adventures. Regardless of how busy they are or what real-life plot twists have been introduced into their story, hello COVID-19, their mission has remained the same. Two middle-aged women on the hunt for a good read. A quick disclaimer, those are their words, not mine. So how about I let them tell you all about it?
Hi, everybody. I am thrilled today to introduce to you Chris Wolak and Emily Fine, who are the dynamic duo behind the popular Book Cougars podcast. Welcome to the show, ladies. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much, John.
Oh, it's my pleasure. This is kind of fun. I feel like the tables have turned a little bit because, usually you're the inquisitors with your bright lights and your dramatic questions. Now it's all turned around and you're in the hot seats, which is kind of fun. So anyway, for people who don't know, you do, as I mentioned, have the Book Cougars podcast, which actually reached a landmark about a month ago, your 100th episode, which is epic and amazing. So congratulations on that. That's a terrific accomplishment. And sort of your log line, your tagline, whatever you want to call it, is two middle-aged women on the hunt for a good read. So I figured, that's an obvious but also a good starting point for this conversation. So can either of you define for me just what it is that you call middle-aged?
Oh, what a great question. You can just start with the easy ones, Chris. Well, it's funny because we've had guests on that say, I can't believe you're willing to say out loud that you're middle-aged. And Chris and I are both kind of like, I hope I'm middle-aged, actually the chances are we're probably past that, theoretically.
Okay, Emily, well, back off.
Not me. Oh my God, there's going to be a dramatic falling out between the books.
No.
Right here.
No, but it is true. People are a little freaked out, some people, about saying that they're middle-aged. And Emily and I are both happy to have made it this far and happy to be alive. And I guess for me, middle age is probably anything from late 30s to 70s.
Yeah.
And, after 80, what's that?
I love your optimism. You might make it to 140. Hey, if anybody can.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I work in math, John, so I feel like, middle-aged, let's hope.
Yeah.
But I also think part of what it is we're really proud to be middle-aged. I think there's a wisdom that we gain from having a little time behind us,
Sure.
And I think both of us bring that to our reading. So I honestly don't mind having that moniker attached to my name at all.
You were both so wonderful and insightful. I thought, I was going to offend you by being a wise ass and then ask you a real question. And you took it and you gave such a wonderful response. But I will ask you, you've already defined middle age, so that's great. Now let me ask you, reading it can be a very subjective experience, obviously. So can you tell me, for your own self, what it is that defines a good read or a good book? either one of you can start. You can fight it out if you want.
I'll let you take that one, Chris.
Well, for me, characters are really important. I have to care about the characters. I don't necessarily have to like them, but I have to be invested in what's going on with them at some level. So that's probably the first thing that I look for.
Which is probably what makes our podcast interesting, because I look for plot. So I think Chris and I read differently. And so when we do read-alongs, I learn so much when I do a read-along with Chris, because she catches a lot of nuance that I don't, because I read, I turn the page looking to find out what's going to happen.
Sure.
So I would probably make a really good rereader, not make a good one, but it would benefit me to reread, but I never take the time to do that. So I'm always looking to see what's going to happen. Tell me a good story. That's what I'm looking for.
Sure. Actually, I'm going to jump ahead in my questions a little bit, because Emily, you said something that lends itself really nicely to that. But I was going to ask you, you obviously both bring very, different tastes and different perspectives to the podcast. So can you talk a little bit more about what you think it is that each of you brings sort of individually or uniquely, and how that benefits the show as a whole?
Yeah, in terms of our conversation and what we read, I think Emily reads a lot of contemporary new releases, and I tend to read classics and older stuff, or maybe history, more nonfiction in that way. So I think we balance each other really well in what we read. So I think that's one of the things that listeners enjoy, is that they get a little bit of a smorgasbord, cornucopia of genres, if you will. We're not just one category of books. So in terms of conversation, I think that's one thing that we balance each other with. What do you think, Emily?
Yeah, and I think because Chris is such a history buff, she also places books in a context of time, which I think is really interesting. So that lends itself to our conversation also, because sometimes even if I'm reading something that's contemporary fiction, if it takes place or has some historical context, I always feel like Chris asks, these inquiring questions that I maybe didn't even ask myself when I was reading the book, So, and I do think that that's part of it, that we have, we have a very conversational style on the podcast. And when people are reading two vastly different books, it just kind of somehow guides the conversation in an interesting way, I think. And what tends to happen is, you'll talk more about one book than another, because we both do kind of read ravenously and have a lot of books to talk about every episode.
Sure. It's kind of funny you would mention that, because usually when, Chris asks me those deep inquiring questions, that's when I look at the time and I'm like, I gotta go.
It's taken some practice, John. We're on episode 103 now. I kind of have it figured out.
I put on my glasses today, I think for the first time in this little show, just because I'm like, maybe I can fake being an intellectual. But anyway, so to go back in time a little bit, we mentioned that you are now past 100 episodes, but can you tell us how you first met and what inspired you? It sounds like a dating show, so how'd you meet? But really, how did you meet, and what inspired you to collaborate on a podcast?
Well, Chris and I both were avid listeners of I think the original book podcast called Books on the Nightstand, that was hosted by Anne Kingman and Michael Kindness. And they started doing these book events called Booktopia, where they would bring in a group of authors and then a group of crazy readers, and we would spend the weekend together at various independent bookstores throughout the country. And they always, once a year, they would host an event in Manchester, Vermont, at Northshire Books, which is such a beautiful bookstore. And Chris and I both were at the Northshire book event in April of 2015. And by that point, Books on the Nightstand had been going for a long time. There had been many Booktopias. So we both had friends that we had met through this event. And Chris had recently...
I'm sorry, I didn't, but we hadn't met yet.
We hadn't met yet, yeah. Right. We had some mutual friends, but she and I hadn't met. And we were at the event, and different people found out that Chris had recently moved to Guilford, Connecticut, and that I was planning to move to Guilford. So they would say to both of us, oh, you should meet Emily. Oh, you should meet Chris. We never got to meet. And I always attribute it to the fact that we're both short, and people would point across a crowded room and be like, you should go meet Chris. You should go meet Emily. And we were both like, I can't see her. So we reached out on Facebook, right, Chris?
Right. Yeah. On Facebook. Yeah.
Yeah. And said, hey, introduced each other virtually. And then I said, well, when I get to Guilford, I'll look you up once I get settled. So in that summer of 2015, we met for the first time I think at a coffee shop off the Guilford Green.
Mm-hmm.
And as you might imagine, we talked about books.
We did. And then we started going to book events together around Connecticut and down into New York, a lot of events in Manhattan. And the event that we went to that spurred the podcast into being was again at Northshire Books. It's a 4.5 hour one-way trip. So we decided to go up to see Ruth Franklin's event, kicking off her biography tour of her Shirley Jackson book. So we drove up there 4.5 hours, attended the event, drive home 4.5 hours, and we talked about books nonstop. And around that time, Books on the Nightstand retired. So we were both feeling this void of not having that podcast to listen to. And Emily turned to me and said, what do you think about doing a podcast like you and me? And it just seemed like a big click.
Yeah, it was funny. Not to, people should know we never had done anything like this in our lives, and we just decided to try it. I mean, we literally took Chris's iPhone to start and just used the voice recorder, right? And just recorded our first podcast. And then we were really, really quickly were able to just kind of split up the workload in what seemed just a natural way based on what both of our strengths are. And it's just been fun ever since, because really we're doing what we were doing before. We're going to book events together or apart, reading books together or apart, and then we get together every other week and record and talk about what we've been reading and what we've been doing in the bookish world.
Right, and now you just invite other people into it, which I think is beautiful. I don't think people realize often what a world of readers there are, and so sort of once you're in that community, you latch on and you don't let them go, but you also realize that you're not that crazy, the only crazy reader person.
Right.
Exactly. Yes.
It's a nice thing, but there really is a great sense of community, and it's so much easier now to come together, with technology than it was before. Even now, we're in 3 separate places, and yet here we are with our books. So let me ask you, what was the initial mission of the Book Cougars podcast, and how has it evolved over time? Because I think that the great thing about your show is it's ever changing. You're not stuck with one idea. You embrace new ideas kind of all the time, whatever fits your show. So can you talk about what it was to begin with and where you think you are now as a podcast?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the things that served us really well in the beginning was to have segments on our show. And that's something, again, Books on the Nightstand did really well. And we'd both listen to a lot of different podcasts, book podcasts, interview podcasts. And we found that having segments helped us as listeners to kind of follow along and to know what to expect, but it's always different content. So we came up with our segments, and they've been pretty much the same. We may have changed the order here and there. We always talk about what we're currently reading, what we've just read, biblio adventures we've been on, biblio adventures we're looking forward to going on, to help listeners know what's coming up. And we've had listeners show up at different events, which is great, that we're helping spread the word with that. And then we'll talk about books we're looking forward to reading soon. And that could be something that's currently sitting on our nightstand right now, or a book that's coming out soon.
Sure.
And I think that probably the biggest change that we made was inviting authors to come on. I don't remember what episode we started that with, but that was a fun adventure to figure it out, how to have someone on and with the technology and timing and everything.
Right. And then it was,
another night, right?
The other part that is hard, I think, for me is to get over, and you might be used to this, John, much more because you interview authors all the time, but just like, I get starstruck. I mean, authors are my rock stars. There's no doubt about it. And so sometimes it's like, oh, I'm supposed to be the one, asking them questions and making sense. And I just want to, like, oh.
Well, Emily's a great Emily's a really great interviewer, and she's moderated events before during those Booktopia events. And so I think that is definitely a strength that Emily brings to the show is talking with authors. She's our communication guru too, I should say.
Yes.
And I'm so appreciative of that. Emily mentioned how our workload just kind of naturally separated, and I do the editing, which is great because it's behind the scenes and I could just squirrel away and do it 2 a.m. if that's how the wind is striking me that day. But Emily handles all of our communication, among other things, which is great because I'm a horrible emailer.
And I spend tons of time in the email world, so it's a natural thing for me, and it's fun too. I'm like, I can't believe I'm emailing so-and-so, it just makes me feel super excited about the world. And I also think we also just like to have conversations. So I think that's the other thing we try to do when we have with ourselves. I mean, we just try to have a conversation about books and the bookish world, and then we do the same with authors. Sure. And hopefully making them feel comfortable and not asking too many trick questions.
Right. They love those, and multi-part questions where they can't
remember
the first part of the question or the second part of the question. Can you repeat that, please?
Right.
Or when you start answering and have no idea what the question was to begin with. How we have our fun.
Well, especially with these video meetings, because I'm always looking at people's books behind them and I get distracted if they're in front of a beautiful shelf.
And that's what book people do. It's anytime there are books behind somebody, I'm entirely distracted, and you should know that I'm paying absolutely no attention to you and looking over your shoulder the entire time. And of course, all we have is books today, which is pretty awesome. But let me ask you this, and you touched on it a little bit, but since you've begun the podcast, you've actually, stepped out from behind the microphone, several times now, and you've done a lot of things in person as well. So can you talk about some of the opportunities or the events that the podcast has sort of lent itself to, and what skill sets, that's allowed you to work on, that's a little bit different than doing a show where you're, yourselves in a closed room versus out in public with an audience and quite possibly an author, looking at you?
Yeah, it is different, isn't it? Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the first event we did in person was with Min Jin Lee for Pachinko. Is that right?
It was. It was at RJ Julia. She was there. We had met her when she was on the release tour for Pachinko. We met her at the Savoy Bookstore and Cafe in Westerly, Rhode Island. And wonderful event. There were, maybe 8 people there. She wasn't a well-known author yet. And then we saw her a couple other times at different events here and there. So when she was coming to RJ Julia, I think we had reached out to ask her if she'd be interested in being on the show since she was going to be in town. And she said, well, hey, why don't you moderate the event? Because then, I won't have to be alone and we can have a conversation. And so that's how that first event started. Or our first live event happened in that way. And it was so much fun.
Yeah, we had a really great time. And they actually recorded it for another podcast, I think. And then we also aired it on our show. And then Bank Square Books asked us to do an event at Mohegan Sun. That was, it was a historical fiction panel with 4 authors. And that was the first time we'd had, we were on a stage and had a bunch of authors, which is tricky because you want to make sure everybody gets time to speak, and we also had to do a lot of reading for it, but they were all great books, fortunately. So
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's been a really nice added boon. It is different, I think, than being, obviously the podcast, partly for obvious reasons you can edit, right, when it's not live. But, it's also that sort of thing where I think you have to pay attention. You really have to listen, which can be hard to do, and be willing to change course based on how the conversation goes. So I think that's a really different feature as well. But in all honesty, as I'm saying that out loud, I feel like we kind of do that, Chris, on the podcast, because we never speak before we sit down to record about what we're going to talk about, or, what books we read or anything like that. It's very free form, as they say.
It really is. And we don't have authors on just to have authors on. We really reach out to people we're interested in talking with. For the most part, and that's not to say people who contact us, sometimes we do have them on because it's like, wow, that's a great book, or, a new author to us, we hadn't heard about them, and it sounds like whatever they're writing is really fascinating. But early on, we did just stick with books that we had read.
Right.
That was, but that gets kind of hard after a while, because we all know, there's millions of books out there. And we can't get to all of them, but we still want to talk with these writers who have written fantastic stories.
Right. I'm still waiting for the Seance edition, maybe for Halloween when you bring Willa Cather back. I've just been waiting for the day.
Wow, you're the first one to mention Willa Cather, not Chris. That's impressive.
I figured it was going to get there at some point, so I was just going to take it and run
Cut to the chase.
Good man, John. Good man.
We can just stop this conversation right now. And
that's right.
But no, to your point, I think there's definitely something to be said for spontaneity, and the conversations that you yourselves have are probably great training ground for putting other people through the paces. But now that we've talked about with your interactions with authors a little bit, I want to ask you about your audience, your listeners, because you're very interactive with them as well. So can you tell us a little bit about the different ways that you are able to engage with your listeners, with other readers, and also how they can, find you on social media, what your platforms are for anybody who might be new to the Book Cougars?
Sure. We are on all, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram are the three social media platforms that we're engaging on a daily basis for the most part. We also have a YouTube channel that we started. Initially, we started it after attending Book Expo, I think. We were really excited to share that experience with our listeners, because not a lot of people can make it to Book Expo, which should be happening right now. It's online this year. And people really enjoyed that response. And that's the thing, like, we love going on book adventures, biblio adventures, as we call them, to author events and author homes. And so sharing that has always been a part of what we like to do as individuals and as our podcast. So those are the ways people can reach us. And I think initially what really helped us was Anne and Michael of Books on the Nightstand. We consider them like our fairy godparents. They were so supportive of us, and they still are. And they helped us get our initial audience, I think, by sharing our podcast early on with the Booktopia community.
Yeah, which is strong. I mean, it's still a strong community, which is so interesting. There's still a Fans of Booktopia Facebook page, and people still share a lot of information there. So we also still share, particularly when we have Anne and Michael on as guests, we always put it out there.
Yeah.
And I think, we do interact a lot on social media, and our handles on all of those platforms are just at Book Cougars. And I think we also get emails from listeners. We do read-alongs. I think read-alongs, we're now doing quarterly read-alongs, where we announce, several months before what our book choice is. And then we have a Goodreads page as well, a Goodreads group page. And we have, what do you call them? Like I don't know.
Discussion threads?
Threads, that's the fancy word. We have threads for all of the different read-alongs. So people, as they're reading them, or just even getting their book from the library, they get on Goodreads and talk about it. So those are ways, I think. And then we do run into listeners at book events, which is really fun. The first time someone recognized us, it was because Chris and I laughed out loud. And we laugh a lot on the podcast. And it was hilarious they were like, I know those laughs, That was really fun.
It was. It kind of freaked us out a little bit. We're like,
yeah.
Somebody.
Yeah. I hid behind Chris. Because that's the other funny thing, it's like being a reader, a lot of us are introverts. I know I have plenty of extroverted reader friends as well, but it's this funny thing where, we read a lot, but we can talk, we're happy to talk about books, like crazy people. But when you get outside of the book world, sometimes we can get a little shy.
Sure.
So I think sometimes that happens to me in public, when we run into people. We ran into 2 listeners at Book Expo last year, which was really fun.
Yeah.
It's nice as long as they're not, the Annie Wilkes variety where you wake up shackled to a bed.
None of that. No.
They were very sweet.
Yes.
What they want you to think.
Well, we also, I think Chris mentioned, we call it our adventures out of our houses and away from books, biblio adventures. So what's super fun for me is when people post to us pictures of their biblio adventures. It's just really warms my heart.
Oh, it's great.
Yeah.
Like you started your own movement, and you've brought them into your reading lives, and that's sort of their way to bring you into theirs, and that's really awesome. I think that's how you're making an impact on people. And I should say you did your first virtual live event with readers pretty recently as well. And I saw the picture on your social media with all the the Brady Bunch with all the boxes and the faces. So you got a really, really nice turnout. And I actually want to ask you about that. It sort of, I think, transitions into an area that I wanted to get into with you, because obviously, we're living in very trying times, COVID-19 and social distancing, even though some people are, sort of starting to relax some of those parameters. But how have you, first in terms of the podcast and your relationship with each other, how have you, adjusted to this new norm, whatever, there's not much norm about it, but how have you adjusted to that, and how have those challenges sort of inspired you to be more creative? Because I would, you keep going, you're all over the internet, you're all over YouTube now, possibly more than you were before. So I think that challenge brings the opportunity for growth and creativity, and you seem to have both embraced that. So can you talk a little bit about that, the transitions and adjustments you've had to make?
What a lovely question. Yeah. Well, we've mentioned how we love to be out in the world going to book events. So I think Chris and I have had, like a lot of people, a lot of sadness about the impact that has had on us and on our friendship, but it's also led to some really interesting changes. One of which is we decided, since we weren't going on biblio adventures, we would start couch biblio adventures. So we started to do a weekly YouTube video that's on our YouTube channel. And really it started just because we wanted to visit with each other. Mm-hmm. So I think our first couple videos were just, us sitting on our own couches and saying, what are you reading? And I miss you, And then we started to invite some people on to join in with us, because I think, frankly, we thought people might get tired of just listening to the 2 of us lament and just talk about a few books. And then what started to happen was, bookstores started to have virtual events. So in a certain way, it's definitely not the same as being in store or, watching authors together on a stage. But what the change for me is that I can also attend events I would never be able to attend, because I went to one the other day in, Philadelphia, which was super cool. So, I hope that we don't have to do this for much longer, but I personally have been able to fill the void. And then with technology, we've been able to record together from a distance, which has been a blessing, although not the same.
Right.
Not the same at all. Yeah. And we, we're fortunate. We do have Patreon sponsors or contributors, donators. I'm not sure what the right word is, who are so generous, and we've been able to buy some fancy equipment recording equipment that really upped our sound quality. So obviously we can't sit in the room together to use those, but we do use Skype and Zoom and these other platforms now to record our episodes that way together. And at least we could see each other on video.
Yeah. Yeah. So, our listeners have been forgiving because we had just, I don't know, Chris, maybe a dozen episodes or something with our new equipment, and we'd really improved our sound. And then, we kind of had to step back to more echoey sound, but we have forgiving listeners.
Yeah.
They're just happy for we're all happy for the engagement. We don't care what you sound like. We just want to listen to you. But let me ask you as well, because I've been talking to a lot of people, readers, writers, lay people in general, and some people have found, that their reading habits or abilities have changed. Some people have found that their writing habits or their productivity has changed. So have you noticed any difference in your, ability to read, or the things that you're gravitating to that seems markedly different than before we sort of entered these times? Or is it the same for you? I can start with you, Chris. I know I should, after all these questions, just pick one of you because.
Sure. You know what? Initially, the first week or so that Laura, my wife, and I decided to start staying home, it was challenging. I was a little hyped up on looking at the news and trying to find information. So I didn't read a lot that first week. But then after that, I kind of settled in and started rationing my news consumption a little bit to help maintain my to help not slide down the slope of anxiety. So my reading has pretty much stayed consistent. I did start reading a little bit more horror than I had been, although that was my first genre that really got me into reading when I was in middle school. So it's been nice to return to that. And I think I just needed something that was edgier and had higher stakes, perhaps.
Sure. And yesterday, well, it'll be a couple of days ago by the time this posts, but it was National Dracula Day, and I saw that people were celebrating that with you because they know how much you love that book.
Yes.
Again, how awesome is that people on Facebook are like, "Hey, thinking of you today, Dracula."
I had a coworker one time who read Dracula and Frankenstein finally and just wrote on Facebook saying, "I thought of you." And everybody, like a lot of people were LOLing, but she knows that I love those books. So, but the implications were interesting.
Yeah. And how about with you, Emily? Is there any changes in either your ability to read or the things that you've been seeking out?
I think for me, reading has always been a form of escape from real life. So I've wanted escape more than ever, and so I've been one of the fortunate ones that seemingly, I've still been able to read consistently. I know a lot of people have been having trouble just reading in general and concentrating. I did find at the very beginning of sheltering in place that I read a page turner, which is, kind of like a crime thriller sort of page turner. And that's not what I read very often. So I think I just needed to get into something that was completely out of the ordinary for me a little bit in a different world. And then after that, I really have just been able to read. I think I've been a little bit more forgiving, just read whatever you want, no rules, and stop a book if it's not working for you. But I've also heard that's something that happens once you turn 50, which happened recently for me. So that you're just, because I'm typically not someone who doesn't stop. Like, even if I don't like a book, I'll plow through it. And now I'm kind of like, yeah, too many books, too little time left.
Right.
Oh, that's great. So let me ask you, because you both have mentioned, Emily, you said, your history with books has always sort of been escapism, which I can certainly relate to. And Chris, you mentioned, that horror was sort of your first genre love back in the day. So can you talk a little bit about your earliest memories with books, and at what point you knew that it was going to be sort of a poignant relationship moving forward and you were always going to be connected to books in some manner? And I'll start with you this time, Emily.
Yeah, I have two really vivid memories, and frankly, I don't have a lot of memories of my childhood, but the home that I grew up in from the age of 5, there was an alley that came out right to the house, and it literally was the alley to the local public library. So I could walk there from a very young age by myself, and I have vivid memories of the smell of it and my first library card and just the feeling of power, that I could walk into this building filled with books and take, so many of them home with me. But I also have a vivid memory of the first time I ran into the biography aisle and just getting a book down. I think it was about Martin Luther King, and sitting in the stacks and just being fascinated that I could learn so much about a person, and that there were just, seemingly, as probably a 7-year-old, what seemed like miles of these books that I could get through. But then the book itself that I remember the most fondly from my childhood is actually The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. And I read it in 6th grade, and I think it was really just the idea that of escapism. It was like the first book where I just left my life completely and stepped into a world so unlike my own, and felt like I could just leave the life that I was living, and that there was a person who could create a world that was so believable and so different. And I think that's where my love of authors began, because I always have had the connection between, there was someone who really toiled away to make this, experience happen for me.
Right, and that's why it's hard to disparage a book, even if you really don't like something, because you can appreciate the effort that went into it.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But anyway, back to you, Chris.
Yeah. So for me, I think one of my earliest memories, I'm the younger child. My sister is 5 years older than I am, and she was the first grandchild. So she had a lot of books. And so one of my first memories with a book was Dr. Seuss's The Alphabet Book, which I still have. It was originally my sister's copy. And I remember sitting on the couch looking through the pictures and the letters and really wanting to read, but not yet being able to read. Although, my mom would come and sit with me and read the words to me. So I guess I probably memorized them initially. But like apple, I think, was one of the first words that I can remember knowing what it looked like on the page. I come from a big family of readers, and I was not necessarily a kid who would sit down and gravitate to a book first. I was a real kind of outdoors, riding my bike, playing war with my cousins and things like that. But and my parents would get me stuff like Cricket magazine and the Big Blue Marble magazine and things like that. But when I was in middle school, we got the Scholastic magazine one day, and our teacher gave us time to look through it. And I turned the page, and bam, there was the book Dracula. And my first thought was like, oh my God, they made a book out of Dracula? Because I love the Bela Lugosi movies so much. I was a real creature features fan, those older horror movies. And I remember asking my parents if I could get it, and they were like, sure, get as many as you want, because they always supported my reading, but didn't try to push anything on me either. So I read it and I loved it. I mean, I remember feeling like it took me the whole summer to read that novel, but I loved it so much. And I felt like I got so much backstory that the movie didn't have. And after that, I remember going to the bookstore, and it was the first time I talked to a bookseller asking for a recommendation. I remember saying, I just read Dracula and I want more books like that. And the clerk gave me Salem's Lot by Stephen King to read next. And then that took me on a whole Stephen King route, which I really credit Stephen King with getting me through high school.
A lot of people do. Oh,
Yeah.
so you would be the Annie Wilkes character, is really what you're saying. Yes, we'll cut that out. Spoiler alert. I was like, yes, if she pans the camera down, there's going to be someone like on her floor. But anyway, let me ask you as well. You've both talked about sort of the first books or reading experiences that you really remember from childhood, from your formative years. But do you each have, books or specific authors that you find yourselves coming back to throughout life again and again? And if so, who or what are those, and what do you think it is that draws you back to them, especially when you were, surrounded by books and deadlines, and yet there are still things that you were compelled to reread? I'm going to start with you, Emily.
Oh, shoot. I was hoping you'd go Chris first on this one. There's so many authors. I think the first person that always comes to mind is Alice Hoffman. I love her books. She's very prolific. She uses magic realism in her writing. So I think it's, just offers that little bit of, outside the norm of your normal life, or also a way to answer some of the unanswerable questions maybe in the world, right? I think magical realism comes in handy there. She always spins a good tale. She's not, an every year prolific author, but she has quite a few under her belt. I've never reread one of her books. I am not a rereader, but I could see myself, when I have more reading time, going back and going to some of her older stories.
Sure.
So I would say she's probably the one that stands out for me.
Should I answer for you, Chris?
Yeah, I think most people know it's Willa Cather for me. I just discovered her when I was an undergraduate, looking through periodicals one day. I was just trying to explore all the periodicals that dealt with literature, and I found one called Western American Literature, which is still going, and they have an annual conference. And there was an article about this author named Willa Cather that I hadn't heard about, and a footnote said that she was probably a lesbian. And I'm gay, so I was stunned to find that there was this canonical American woman writer who was gay that I'd never heard about. So that really just spurred me on to this lifelong love of her writing. And I'm on a mission to read all of her short pieces now, which is what I've been doing. So, and I guess one of the things too that attracted me was that I spent a lot of time in Nebraska as a kid. My parents used to live there before I was born, and we'd go back every summer to visit. And I love Nebraska, and she's a Nebraska writer and writes so beautifully about it. So I think, having the connection of her being gay, Nebraska, it just hit a lot of commonalities.
Sure.
Yeah, and she's just such a beautiful writer.
Yeah.
I have a dream that, because I don't think I would take the time to do it, but I have a dream that one of our listeners will listen to every episode of the podcast and note the time when Chris mentions Willa Cather. It's always a mystery to me. Like, is she going to mention Willa Cather this episode? When will it come? I love it. I love her passion.
I think the mystery would be when.
True.
That could be like a fun drinking game, and it doesn't have to be alcohol. It could be coffee or tea. Chris says, "Well, we take a sip."
Oh, too funny.
Well, we're doing a creative journaling class together with Chris's wife, and
fun.
At one point we had to do. I think it's called doodle heads.
Doodleheads, yeah.
Different people in your life for different reasons, like someone who makes you laugh, someone you like spending time with. So the person I like spending time with was Chris, and I cannot draw to save my life, but I drew a lot of hair because I have a lot of hair envy of Chris. And then I wrote at the top, "Do you know who Willa Cather is?" And then it was like, Willa Cather, Willa Cather, Willa Cather.
Well, some things just go better together. I mean,
that's right.
Worse associations. All right. Well, I think I am going to start to wrap it up, but I really appreciate your time. I do want to ask you, I am going to throw out one of those two-part questions just for fun to see who remembers it and who doesn't. But I want to ask you, say within the last, month or two, can you give me one or two books that you've read that for whatever reason has, stuck with you, been particularly meaningful to you? And then to take a page out of the Book Cougars book, can you also tell me what it is right now that you're looking forward to reading to? We can start with Chris this time.
Oh boy. What have I read recently? I have read a book called You Let Me In by Camilla Bruce. It just came out in March, and it's her first novel. She's a Norwegian writer who taught herself English. So I believe it was written in English. And it is just such a wild, imaginative novel. It is about a young girl who has this really rich fantasy life, or is it not a fantasy life? There is this creature called Mr. Pepper who visits her every night, who causes havoc, chaos in her life. And it deals a lot with trauma and violence against girls in a very unique way. I think it could be destined to become like a feminist classic, because it really deals with subject matter in just such a fresh new way.
Sure.
Yeah.
Now
And then, I'm sorry.
I feel like I need to read that now.
You know what? You would like it, I think. It's very different. And had somebody described the book to me, I probably wouldn't have read it, because, it's this fairy tale tradition. I'm not interested in that, supposedly, but I really love the book. And then what I'm looking forward to is Louise Penny's next novel, All the Devils Are Here. And that's part of her Three Pines series. And that one's coming out in September.
Excellent. Thank you. Emily?
So there's a reason I put cookbooks as my background. Thank you to Green Apple Books, by the way, because that's a bookstore in San Francisco that has put up a bunch of really cool Zoom backgrounds that people can use. And I've had the fortune of going to that bookstore. It's a fantastic bookstore. But I love to cook. So I talk about cookbooks on the podcast quite a bit. And one of the things I've been doing just to kind of relax my mind a little bit is reading my cookbooks, which I don't do very often. I mean, I'll get them out to, look up a recipe and get some ideas, but I've really been spending more time with them. And I thought I would share this. Is hilarious. I don't know if you can see it because I've got a weird background. I guess you can't. But this one doesn't even have its cover anymore. And it has electrical tape on the side. That's how beloved this book is. It's called Bread Machine Magic. And the reason I wanted to talk about this book is because, people are posting all over social media their beautiful sourdough breads that they're making, and, just become a bread baker overnight. But if you don't have that, desire or time, you can also get yourself a bread machine and a cookbook like this. And make bread by throwing a bunch of stuff in a machine and pushing a button. So, and I used to actually bake bread for a living, but I think bread machines do a great job. So Bread Machine Magic, it's by Lois Conway and Linda Ryberg. And then the other book I've been spending a lot of time reading, because we are in New England and ice cream season is upon us. So I pulled out my book, The Perfect Scoop by David Lebovitz. And this is a cookbook I adore. I have a really small Cuisinart ice cream maker, and I love making ice cream, and I love eating ice cream. And frankly, I'll eat ice cream year round, but we're definitely in the season here as well. And then the book I'm super looking forward to reading is called Shantaram by Gregory David Roberts. It's 1,000 pages. So it's been languishing on my bookshelf for years. I actually got a copy when we went to Booktopia events. That one of the first kind of icebreaker events they have is called a Yankee Swap, where everyone brings a wrapped book, and then there's a big swap and people can steal books from each other. And this is the book that I ended up with. And people wax poetic about this book. Like, it's the book that changed my life. And I've started it a couple times and not gotten through it, but our buddy Sue, who has it's the Book by Book blog, is that right?
Yeah, Book by Book blog, yeah.
Yeah, she has this big summer read where you read books that are over 400 pages, I think, is the size. And so I've outed myself. I am committed in the world of social media and everything that I'm going to tackle this book this summer. So I believe that I have people who are going to hold me accountable. So we'll see how it goes.
So exciting. That's one of the fun things about having a partner doing this podcast, is that I get to read my own books, but I also live through Emily and what she's reading. So when she announces what she's going to be reading like that, I'm always like, oh, good. I can't wait to hear what she thinks.
Right, and then we're going to reconvene, like, say, September.
Right.
Emily.
Emily arrives with her tail between her legs. Yeah, no, I think I'm pretty sure that the challenge is from Memorial Day to Labor Day. So I do have some time, beginning of September. I've got my work cut out for me, but I believe. And Chris is participating too, and she did a post on her blog, which I'm going to call out. It's chriswolak.com. And it was really cute because these books are so big, you know, so she had a ruler by her stack of books, which I just loved.
Yeah, 9 inches of books. We'll
That's
see.
right.
I mean, my
of other things. I mean, different things. Good for you, Chris. I saw that the other day. I laughed.
Yeah. Well, I'm planning on, we'll see. I don't think I'll get to all of them, but you know, hope springs eternal when it comes to books and stacks.
Yes.
At least you can say you have a plan, you know?
That's right.
And I guess now is certainly the time to at least try. So Chris Wolak, Emily Fine, the Book Cougars, thank you so much. And before we wrap this up, I have to ask if you can do me a favor. You know, can you do your sort of trademark? Can we end on that?
Oh, we can try. Let's clear our voices, Chris. Ready?
Yeah.
I don't know.
That was pretty good. That seems like an ending point to me. So I'm just going to stop recording right there.
That's it for this episode of Central Booking. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a thing.